The wind howled through the cracks in the old log cabin, carrying with it the bitter cold of another Wyoming winter. Silas Boone sat hunched over his rough-hewn table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow and a sheet of paper before him. The lamplight flickered across his weathered face, casting shadows that made the lines around his eyes seem deeper than his 42 years should warrant. He'd been staring at that blank paper for the better part of an hour, wrestling with words that didn't come easy to a man who'd spent more time talking to horses than people these past 10 years. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the mountainside in a silence so complete it made his ears ring. Silas took another pull from the bottle, feeling the burn slide down his throat, and finally put pen to paper. To the Matrimonial News Agency of Boston, he wrote in careful, blocky letters, "I am a man of simple needs, seeking a wife of quiet disposition. Must cook, keep house, and ask no questions about the past. I offer a solid roof, 3 meals daily, and the protection of my name. No romantics need apply. S. Boone, Grizzly Hollow, Wyoming Territory." He sealed the letter with candle wax and set it aside. Come morning, he'd ride the 15 miles down to town and post it. The decision made, he should have felt relief. Instead, he felt only the familiar weight of loneliness pressing against his ribs. 3 months later, on a day when the March winds still carried winter's bite, Silas stood on the platform at Grizzly Hollow's depot. The train was late, as usual. He pulled his coat tighter and took a swig from his flask, watching the horizon where the rails disappeared into the gray distance. Around him, the good people of Grizzly Hollow went about their business, but he caught their sideways glances. Silas Boone didn't come to town often, and when he did, folks gave him a wide berth. Some remembered him from the old days, when he'd ridden with men whose names were better left unspoken. Others simply knew him as the hermit who lived up on Redemption Ridge, trading pelts and keeping to himself. The train whistle pierced the air, and soon the great iron beast came chugging into view, black smoke billowing into the pale sky. Silas straightened, his hand unconsciously checking the letter in his pocket, the one that confirmed Miss Evelyn Carter of Richmond, Virginia, would be arriving on today's noon train. The locomotive ground to a halt with a screech of metal and a hiss of steam. Passengers began to disembark, traveling salesmen with their cases, a few ranch hands returning from Denver, a minister and his wife. Silas waited, the whiskey bottle hanging loose in his right hand. Then he saw her. She stood in the doorway of the passenger car, pausing at the top of the steps as if taking the measure of this new world. Everything about her was unexpected. Where he'd imagined a sturdy farm woman in sensible calico, she wore a dress of faded black bombazine that had once been fine. Where he'd pictured rosy cheeks and a broad smile, her face was pale as winter moonlight. Her full lips set in a line that spoke neither welcome nor fear, but it was her eyes that made him forget the whiskey in his hand. They were the gray of storm clouds over the prairie, and in them, he saw something he recognized. The look of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side, scorched but not broken. She descended the steps with careful grace, a single carpetbag in her gloved hand. The wind caught at her dark hair, which was pinned up severely beneath a plain black bonnet, and that's when he saw it. A scar, pale against her skin, running from her jawline down into the high collar of her dress. The whiskey bottle slipped from Silas's fingers and shattered on the platform. He didn't notice. Evelyn Carter walked toward him with measured steps, her boots clicking on the wooden boards. Behind her, he could already hear the whispers starting. "That's her, the one from Virginia. Heard she killed a man back east. Black Widow. They called her in the papers." What's Silas Boone thinking, bringing a woman like that here? If she heard them, she gave no sign. She stopped before him, set down her carpetbag, and spoke in a voice like smoke and honey. "Mr. Boone, I presume." He nodded, suddenly aware of his rough appearance, the beard he hadn't trimmed in weeks, the coat patched with deer hide, the smell of whiskey and wood smoke that clung to him like a second skin. "Miss Carter," he managed. "Mrs. Carter." she corrected softly. "Though I suppose that will change soon enough." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them. She didn't shiver, didn't pull her thin shawl tighter. She simply stood there, waiting, those storm-gray eyes taking his measure just as he was taking hers. "You have a conveyance?" she asked when the silence stretched too long. "Wagons outside?" He bent to pick up her carpet bag, noticed how light it was. Whatever life she'd had in Virginia, she'd left it behind. He understood that feeling. As they walked through the depot, he was acutely aware of the attention they drew. Martin Fletcher, who ran the general store, actually stepped out onto his porch to stare. The banker's wife pulled her children closer as they passed. Even the saloon girls peering from the Lucky Strike's windows seemed subdued. Eveline kept her chin up, her gaze fixed straight ahead. There was a quality to her silence that was different from mere quietness. It was the silence of someone who had learned that words could be weapons turned against you. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, noting how her gloved fingers trembled slightly as she grasped his hand. The first sign of any emotion she'd shown. As he walked around to climb up beside her, he caught sight of Sheriff Watson watching from his office doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's 15 miles to my place," Silas said as he took up the reins. "Road's rough." "I don't mind rough roads. Mr. Boone." He glanced at her profile as he guided the horses out of town. In the harsh afternoon light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Perhaps 30. No more. The scar was more visible now, a pale line that disappeared beneath black fabric. He wondered who had given it to her, then pushed the thought away. He'd asked for no questions about the past. That went both ways. As Grizzly Hollow fell away behind them and the road began to climb toward the mountains, Eveline finally spoke again. "They talked about me, on the train. They didn't think I could hear, but voices carry in those passenger cars." She turned to look at him fully. "Does it matter to you, what they say?" Silas considered his answer as the horses plodded up the increasingly steep trail. The truth was, he'd heard the stories when her first letter arrived. The postmaster's wife had relatives in Richmond, and news traveled even to the Wyoming territory. Eveline Carter tried for the murder of her husband, acquitted for lack of evidence, but in the court of public opinion. That hardly mattered. "I reckon everyone's got things they'd rather leave buried," he said finally. "That's why folks come west." She studied him for a long moment, then faced forward again. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose that's true." The rest of the journey passed in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the awkward absence of words between strangers, but something that felt almost like understanding. The snow began to fall harder as they climbed, and Silas noticed her pull her shawl tighter. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out to her. She looked at the offered coat, then at him. For the first time, something that might have been warmth flickered in those gray eyes. "Thank you," she said, and wrapped it around her shoulders as they climbed higher into the mountains, toward the isolated cabin that would be her new home. Silas found himself stealing glances at this woman who was nothing like what he'd expected. He'd asked for someone quiet who wouldn't ask questions. Looking at Eveline Carter's scarred face and steady hands, he realized he might have gotten more than he bargained for. The cabin came into view just as the last light was fading from the sky, a dark shape against the white mountainside. Home, such as it was. He wondered what she would think of it, this woman in her once fine dress with her mysterious past. "It ain't much," he said, suddenly defensive of his simple dwelling. Eveline Carter looked at the cabin, then at the mountains rising all around them, then finally at him. "It's perfect," she said, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she almost smiled. The cabin was exactly what Eveline had expected from a man who lived alone on a mountain, and yet it surprised her too. Yes, it was rough-hewn and sparse, with gaps between the logs that let in whistling drafts, but it was clean, orderly in the way of someone who had learned discipline through hard living. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but blackened from years of use. The floor was worn smooth by boots and time. She set her carpetbag near the door and moved slowly through the main room, her fingers trailing over surfaces, the scarred table, the two mismatched chairs, the shelf holding a few books with cracked spines. Everything here had been chosen for function, not comfort. Yet there was something honest about that. No pretense, no lies. Silas stood by the door, watching her explore his space with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything and give away nothing. He'd removed his hat, and in the dim light filtering through the single window, she could see his hair was still dark, touched with silver at the temples. "There's a room through there," he said, gesturing to a doorway covered by a heavy blanket. "It's yours. I'll bunk out here." Eveline paused in her examination of an old photograph on the mantel. Soldiers, by the look of their uniforms, though the image was too faded to make out faces. "That's kind of you, Mr. Boone, but unnecessary. We'll be married within the week, won't we? There's no point in maintaining proprieties that don't matter out here." He shifted uncomfortably. "Just the same. Until it's official." She nodded, accepting this small courtesy. Moving to the cook stove, she ran her hand over its cold iron surface. "When did you last have a proper meal?" "I manage." "That wasn't what I asked." He almost smiled at that. "Been a while." Without another word, Eveline unpinned her traveling bonnet and set it aside, then rolled up her sleeves. The movement was practiced, efficient. Is there a root cellar? Supplies? "Out back. Cellar's stocked. Spring house for what needs keeping cold." "Good. I'll need water. I'll fetch it." He grabbed a bucket and headed for the door, seeming relieved to have something to do. Alone. Eveline allowed herself a moment to simply stand still. The silence here was different from the silence of her cell in Richmond while she awaited trial. Different from the silence of the boarding house where she'd spent these last months. Avoided by decent folk and propositioned by the rest. This silence was clean, empty of judgment and expectation. She found her way to the cellar, noting with approval the stores laid in. Potatoes, turnips, onions, dried beans, salt pork, and flour. A man who planned ahead, who understood that winter in these mountains was no gentle thing. By the time Silas returned with the water, she had a fire going in the stove and was peeling potatoes with a knife she'd found in a drawer. "You don't have to," he began. "Yes, I do." She didn't look up from her work. "We have an arrangement. Mr. Boone, you offered 3 meals daily. I agreed to cook them. I'd like to start as I mean to go on." He set the bucket down carefully. "We should discuss the terms, make things clear." "By all means." He pulled out one of the chairs. The scrape of wood on wood loud in the quiet cabin. "The justice of the peace comes through town first Monday of each month. That's 6 days hence. He'll marry us legal and proper. After that, you'll be Mrs. Boone, with all the protection that name affords." Protection. She tested the word like she might test the edge of a blade. "And what do you get in return?" "A wife, someone to keep house, cook, maybe." He paused, cleared his throat. "Maybe make this place a little less like a grave." Eveline's hand stilled on the potato. "Is that what it feels like to you? A grave?" "Sometimes." The admission seemed to surprise him. She resumed peeling, long strips falling into the bowl. "I don't require love. Mr. Boone, I've had love. It started with flowers and poetry and ended with—" Her hand went unconsciously to her throat, where the scar disappeared beneath fabric. "I prefer plain dealing now. Then we understand each other." "Do we?" She finally looked at him directly. "Do you know what they say about me?" "Some. And yet you sent for me anyway. Why?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands spread flat on the table. They were capable hands, scarred from work and weather and other things. "Maybe because I figured a woman who'd been through what you'd been through wouldn't ask questions about blood that won't wash clean. Or why a man wakes up calling names of folks 10 years dead." The only sound was the pop of wood in the stove and the whisper of her knife against potato skin. When she spoke again, Her voice was soft. The war? After, mostly. Did things I ain't proud of. Rode with men who... He shook his head. Don't matter now. That man's dead. I came up here to bury him. And did you? Bury him? Thought I had, but the dead don't always stay buried. Do they, Mrs. Carter? She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. In the lamplight, the scar was a silver thread against her pale skin. No, Mr. Boone. They don't. They looked at each other across the small space. Two people who had fled to the edge of the world to escape their ghosts. Outside. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending drafts through the gaps in the walls. Eveline shivered. I'll fix those gaps come spring. Silas said, keep the worst of it out for now with some rags and mud chinking. I can help with that. You ever chinked a cabin before? No, but I've done harder things. He believed her. Dinner was simple. Fried potatoes and salt pork, biscuits made from flour, water, and lard. But it was hot and filling, and Silas couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. They ate in companionable silence, the strange comfort of two people who didn't need to fill the quiet with meaningless chatter. After, while Eveline washed the dishes, Silas showed her the rest of the cabin. The bedroom was small, just large enough for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. He'd already moved his few possessions out, leaving only a quilt that looked handmade. Was that your mother's? She asked, touching the intricate stitching. Wife's. She pulled her hand back as if burned. I didn't know you'd been married before. Didn't last long. Fever took her the second winter. That was 15 years ago now. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But Eveline heard what he didn't say. That time didn't always dull certain kinds of pain. She understood that too. That first night. She lay in the narrow bed listening to him moving around in the main room, banking the fire, settling onto what sounded like a makeshift pallet on the floor. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and age. She wondered about the woman who had stitched it, who had come to this lonely place as a bride and died before she could make it a home. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, she heard what might have been a wolf, or perhaps it was just the mountain playing tricks, in Richmond. The nights had been full of different sounds, carriage wheels on cobblestones, distant laughter from taverns, the whistle of trains. Here, there was only the wind and the settling of wood and Silas Boone's breathing from the other room. She must have dozed, because she woke to the sound of voices. No, one voice, Silas, caught in some dream, calling out names she didn't recognize. The words were slurred with sleep and old terror, but she caught enough to understand. Commands, warnings, the kind of things a man shouts in battle or its aftermath. Without thinking, she rose and padded barefoot to the doorway. He was thrashing on his pallet, blankets twisted around him, face contorted. She'd seen Thaddeus in the grip of night terrors, but those had been different, the nightmares of a man whose demons were of his own making. This was the look of someone haunted by things done in desperate hours. Mr. Boone, she called softly. When he didn't wake, she stepped closer. Silas. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, he didn't seem to see her. Then recognition dawned, followed quickly by embarrassment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. The wind did. It was a small kindness. This lie. She pulled her shawl tighter around her nightgown. Would you like some coffee? I find it helps, after dreams like that. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. It's the middle of the night. So it is. She moved to the stove anyway, stirring the banked coals back to life. I used to walk the nights away back in Richmond, after the house felt too full of ghosts to sleep. And here, she considered as she measured coffee into the pot. Different ghosts, quieter ones. They sat at the table in the dim light, sharing bitter coffee and the particular intimacy of two insomniacs in the small hours. Neither spoke of what had driven them from sleep. There was no need. The understanding ran deeper than words. As dawn began to gray the windows, Eveline finally asked, "Those names you were calling, were they friends?" Some weren't." He stared into his empty cup. "You ever do something necessary that damned you anyway?" "Yes." No hesitation in her answer. "Then you know." "I know." Outside, a rooster crowed somewhere down the mountain, probably at one of the scattered homesteads that dotted the lower slopes. The day was beginning, their first full day under the same roof. "I should start breakfast," Eveline said. "I should see to the animals." Neither moved. "This is strange," she said finally. "Which part?" "All of it. You, me, this place. It's like we're playing house, except neither of us remembers the rules. Maybe that's better, making up our own rules as we go." She looked at him then, really looked at him, saw the lines that grief and violence had carved into his face, the wariness in his eyes that matched her own, but also something else, a kindness he tried to hide, a capacity for gentleness that surprised them both. "Maybe it is," she agreed, and rose to start the day. By the fourth day, they had settled into a rhythm of sorts. Eveline rose before dawn to start the coffee and biscuits. Silas saw to the horses and the small collection of chickens he kept in a coop behind the cabin. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, then went about their separate tasks, him to check his trap lines or repair the endless things that needed fixing, her to the domestic work she'd agreed to take on. It was on this fourth day that they had visitors. Eveline heard the horses before she saw them, the sound carrying clear in the mountain air. She was kneading bread dough, her hands flour-dusted and her hair pinned back severely. Through the window, she watched 3 riders approach, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in their Sunday best despite it being Thursday. "Silas?" she called quietly. He emerged from the lean-to where he'd been splitting wood, axe still in hand. The lead rider was a portly man with graying whiskers and a collar that marked him as clergy. Beside him rode a woman who could only be his wife, sharp-faced, thin-lipped, sitting her horse like she had a poker for a spine. The third was younger, perhaps the church deacon, with the eager look of someone hoping to witness scandal. "Reverend Walsh," Silas said, setting down the axe but not moving to welcome them closer. "Mrs. Walsh, Deacon Porter, Brother Boone." The Reverend's voice was hearty, but his eyes were cold as they fixed on Eveline visible through the window. "We heard you had taken in a visitor." "My intended," Silas corrected. "Soon to be my wife." Mrs. Walsh sniffed audibly. "Yes, we heard about that too. From Virginia, isn't she?" "She is. Richmond, specifically." "Mrs. Walsh continued, her voice dripping false sweetness. "Such an interesting city. One hears such stories from there." Eveline wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch. She didn't speak, just stood beside Silas with her chin raised and her gray eyes steady. The morning sun caught her scar, making it impossible to miss. "Mrs. Carter," the Reverend said, touching his hat brim in the barest acknowledgement of courtesy. "I am Reverend Walsh, spiritual shepherd to the good people of Grizzly Hollow. This is my wife, Mrs. Walsh, and Deacon Porter." "Reverend." Eveline's voice was cool as spring water. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Mrs." Walsh's mouth pursed tighter. "We've come to offer Christian counsel. Naturally, when a new member joins our community, especially one with such a colorful background, it's our duty to ensure they understand the importance of redemption and proper conduct." "How charitable of you," Eveline said. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Brother Boone, might we speak privately, man to man? Anything you gotta say, you can say in front of Mrs. Carter." "Very well." The Reverend's facade of friendliness cracked slightly. "There are concerns in town about the wisdom of this arrangement." "You're a respected man, despite your solitary ways. Your choice of bride reflects not just on you, but on our entire community." "Does it now?" Richmond society cast her out for good reason. "Mrs. Walsh interjected, unable to contain herself. "The trial may have failed to convict, but we all know that where there's smoke, there's usually someone lighting fires." Eveline finished quietly. Yes, I'm familiar with the principle. The deacon shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Silas took a step forward, not quite threatening, but no longer passive. I reckon you've said your piece. He told them, now I'll say mine. Mrs. Carter and I will be married come Monday by Judge Morrison. All legal and proper. After that, she'll be Mrs. Boone, and any man or woman who speaks ill of my wife will answer to me. That clear enough for you, Reverend? The Reverend's face flushed. You would threaten a man of God? I would protect what's mine. God understands that, even if his messengers don't. Mrs. Walsh gasped at the blasphemy. This is exactly what comes of consorting with murderers and— Catherine! The Reverend's sharp tone cut her off. He gathered his reins. We've delivered our message. What you do with it is between you and the Lord. But don't expect a welcome in town, either of you. And don't come crying to the church when this all ends in blood, as it surely will. They wheeled their horses and rode off, the deacon casting one last curious glance back at Eveline. She stood perfectly still until they were out of sight, then sagged slightly against the porch rail. Well, she said, that was bracing. Silas was still staring after them, jaw clenched. Pack of hypocrites. Walsh took money from the collection plate 2 winters back when his gambling debts came due. His wife spreads more poison than a rattler, and that deacon's been sneaking into the saloon girls' cribs when he thinks nobody's looking. Every town has its share. Eveline turned to go back inside. The bread needs tending. He caught her arm gently. It don't bother you, what they said. She looked down at his hand on her sleeve, then up at his face. I've heard worse, from people who mattered more. That evening, the confrontation hung between them like smoke. Eveline prepared dinner, venison stew and fresh bread, but ate little herself. Silas noticed her pushing food around her bowl, the way she kept touching her throat where the scar disappeared beneath her collar. You want to tell me? He asked finally. About what happened? She set down her spoon. You said no questions about the past. I did, but maybe some ghosts need speaking aloud before they'll rest. Eveline rose and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering darkness. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as if telling someone else's story. His name was Thaddeus Blackwood. He was handsome, charming, from one of Richmond's best families. I was 22, working as a governess for a merchant's children. Not quite servant, not quite family. The perfect target for a man like him. She paused, fingers tracing patterns on the glass. He courted me properly. Flowers, poetry, promises of a grand life. My employers warned me, but I was young and foolish and thought I was in love. We married in spring. By summer, I knew what he really was. He hurt you. It wasn't a question. Eveline's laugh was bitter. Hurt me. He was an artist of pain. Mr. Boone, physical when he was drunk. Other ways when he was sober. He kept me like you'd keep a prized bird in a beautiful cage, wings clipped, singing on command. Silas had risen now too, standing behind her but not touching, waiting. 5 years I endured it. 5 years of bruises hidden under powder, of stories about clumsy accidents, of sleeping with one eye open. The servants knew, but who speaks against a Blackwood? His family knew, but I was doing my wifely duty by keeping him entertained at home instead of in the brothels. Her hand went to her throat again. The night it ended, he'd been drinking more than usual. There was a letter. Someone had told him they'd seen me speaking to a man at the market, just asking the price of carrots. But in Thaddeus's mind, I was planning to run away. He had a knife, said if he couldn't have me perfect, he'd make sure no one else would want me. She turned to face Silas, and in the lamplight, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I didn't plan it. When he came at me with the blade, I just reacted. There was a poker by the fireplace. One swing. They said he died instantly. Good, Silas said flatly. That startled a real laugh out of her. The jury didn't agree. Well, half of them. The Blackwood family lawyer painted me as a scheming fortune hunter who'd planned it all along. The prosecutor tried, but without witnesses. The judge instructed them to acquit for lack of evidence, but everyone knew what that meant. Not innocent, just not provably guilty. And his family made sure no decent household would employ me, made sure the story followed me wherever I went. Virginia, Maryland, even Philadelphia. Finally, I saw your advertisement and thought, Wyoming territory, surely that's far enough. It is, Silas said firmly. It has to be. She smiled sadly. You heard the Reverend. The story's already here. It'll be all over town by Sunday. You could still withdraw your offer. Find another bride, one who doesn't come with such baggage. Could I? He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. And where would I find another woman who understands why I wake up screaming? Who knows what it means to do something that saves your life but damns your soul? Who can meet those vultures on the porch without flinching? You're a fool. Silas Boone. Maybe, but I'm a fool who keeps his word. Come Monday, you'll be my wife, and if the good people of Grizzly Hollow don't like it, they can take their business elsewhere. You need their business. For supplies, I need very little. Less than you might think. He hesitated, then reached out to touch the scar on her throat, his fingers barely grazing the raised tissue. He's dead. That's all that matters. Let the dead bury the dead. She caught his hand, held it against her cheek for a moment. Sometimes I dream he's not, that he's coming for me. Stupid, I know. Not stupid. I dream the same about men I killed, that they're riding up the mountain, coming to collect what's owed. He pulled his hand back, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. But dreams are just dreams, and if any man, living or dead, tries to hurt you again, they'll have to go through me, my protector, she said. But it wasn't mockery. What did I do to deserve such devotion? You showed up, he said simply. Sometimes that's enough. That night, a spring storm rolled over the mountains, bringing thunder that shook the cabin and rain that drummed against the roof. Eveline lay in her narrow bed, listening to the fury outside, and felt safer than she had in years. When lightning illuminated her room, she saw Silas's shape in the doorway. Just checking, he said. Storm's not bothering you? No, I like storms. They're honest, all that power, right there where you can see it. Not like the quiet violence that comes in daylight, dressed in good manners. He understood. Of course he did. 3 more days, he said. Then it's official. Yes. She pulled the quilt higher. Silas, thank you for today, for standing up to them. Don't thank me for doing what's right. In my experience, that's exactly what deserves thanks. So few people do. He nodded and turned to go, then paused. Eveline, that scar don't make you less beautiful. Just want you to know that. Before she could respond, he was gone, returning to his pallet in the main room. Eveline touched her throat, feeling the familiar ridge of damaged flesh. For the first time since that terrible night, she didn't flinch from the sensation. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the cabin, 2 damaged souls had found something neither had dared hope for: understanding, acceptance, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of home. Spring came to the mountains like a cautious visitor, melting snow in patches while leaving white caps on the highest peaks. By late April, the meadow below the cabin had erupted in wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and mountain avens, creating a patchwork quilt of color against the new grass. Eveline stood in what would be their kitchen garden, her sleeves rolled up and dirt under her fingernails for the first time in years. It felt good, this honest work. She'd found seeds in town during their monthly supply run. Silas had been right that some folks would still trade with them, mostly those who lived on the margins themselves and understood what it meant to be judged. Rows need to be straighter. Silas called from where he was mending the fence. There was teasing in his voice, a lightness that had developed between them over the past month of marriage. The vegetables won't care if they're growing in perfect lines, she shot back. They're not being inspected by the Richmond Ladies' Garden Society. He chuckled, a sound she'd learned to treasure for its rarity. Their wedding had been a brief affair. Just them, Judge Morrison, and 2 reluctant witnesses pulled from the saloon, But it had been legal and binding, and the simple gold band on her finger, purchased from the traveling merchant who asked no questions, felt more real than the elaborate diamond Thaddeus had once slipped onto her hand. They worked in companionable rhythm, him reinforcing the fence posts, her planting neat sections of beans, squash, and potatoes. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and releasing the scent of sage and pine. By midday, they were both sweating despite the mountain coolness. "Break time," Evelyn announced, fetching the water jug and the simple lunch she'd packed, cold biscuits, dried beef, and last year's preserved peaches. They sat in the shade of a large pine, looking out over their small domain. The cabin looked different now. Evelyn had insisted on whitewashing the logs, and curtains hung in the windows. Small touches, but they transformed the place from a hideout to a home. "Never thought I'd be a farmer," Silas said, taking a long drink of water. "You're not. You're a trapper who happens to have a garden. There's a difference." "Is there now?" "Certainly. Farmers are respectable. Trappers are mysterious mountain men who make town ladies clutch their pearls. And which do you prefer?" She pretended to consider. "Oh, the mountain man. Definitely. Respectability is overrated." It was moments like these that surprised them both. The easy banter, the shared humor. Their physical relationship had progressed slowly, tentatively. They shared a bed now, but touch came gradually. A hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed dishes. The careful way he moved her hair aside to kiss her neck. Both carried too many scars, visible and invisible, to rush toward intimacy. But it was building, this thing between them. Not the desperate passion of youth or the calculating arrangement they'd initially planned, but something steadier, something that might last. That afternoon, while Silas went to check his trap lines, Evelyn worked on expanding the garden. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. 3 men, strangers all. They didn't have the look of settlers or merchants. Their clothes were too new, their horses too fine, Eastern horses, bred for show, not mountain work. The lead rider tipped his hat, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am. This the Boone place?" Evelyn rose slowly, very aware that Silas's rifle was inside the cabin and her hands held only a trowel. "It is. My husband's not here at present." "That's all right. It's you we came to see. Mrs. Boone? Is it now?" The way he said it made her skin crawl. "Though I knew you by another name, Mrs. Blackwood." Her blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean." "My name is Evelyn Boone." The second man, older with gray at his temples, pulled out a piece of paper. "Legal documents say otherwise. I'm Arthur Hutchins, attorney at law, representing the Blackwood estate. This is Mr. James Blackwood, brother of your late husband, and Mr. Porter, a detective in his employ. James Blackwood." She saw the resemblance now, the same cruel mouth, the same cold eyes. But where Thaddeus had hidden his nature behind charm, James wore his openly, "What do you want?" Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Justice," James said flatly. "You murdered my brother and walked free because the jury was too squeamish to hang a woman. But there's new evidence. A maid who's ready to testify she saw you planning it, reading books about poisons, practicing with that poker. That's a lie. But she knew it didn't matter. The Blackwoods had money and influence. They could buy any testimony they wanted." "Is it?" Hutchins pulled out another paper. "We also have a witness who saw you dispose of jewelry that night, my brother's mother's diamonds, which mysteriously vanished. Theft and murder, Mrs. Blackwood. Or should I say, Widow Blackwood? My name is Boone." She lifted her chin. "And you're trespassing. I'll ask you to leave. Not until you've heard our offer." James dismounted, standing too close. She could smell his cologne. So like his brother's, it made her stomach turn. "Come back to Richmond. Face trial again. If you're truly innocent, you have nothing to fear, except a rope, courtesy of your paid witnesses." His smile was sharp. The alternative is we make your life here difficult, starting with informing everyone in this quaint little town exactly who you are and what you've done. Your husband's business will dry up. You'll be shunned, hounded. Is that what you want for him? To destroy his life, too? Get off my land. The new voice came from behind her. Silas stood at the corner of the cabin, rifle in hand, barrel pointed at the ground but ready. He must have heard the horses and circled back. Ah, the new husband. James's smile widened. Tell me, Mr. Boone, did she seduce you the way she did my brother? Pretty thing, despite the scar. Did she cry prettily about her tragic past? Play the victim? I said, get off my land. Silas's voice was flat. Dangerous. You got about 10 seconds to mount up. Hutchins raised a placating hand. Now, sir, there's no need for threats. We're here on legal business. Your wife is wanted for questioning in Virginia regarding... The rifle swung up. Not quite aimed, but close enough. 5 seconds. Porter, the detective, put his hand on his sidearm. You threatening officers of the law? I see no badges. I see 3 men who rode onto my property and started harassing my wife. Way I see it, that makes you trespassers at best. Claim jumpers at worst. Both get the same treatment out here. You're making a mistake, James said, but he was already backing toward his horse. She's a killer. She'll turn on you too, when she gets bored or finds someone richer. Silas smiled then, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mister, I've killed more men than she's had hot dinners. If anyone should be worried, it's her. Now get. They mounted up, but James had one last shot. This isn't over. The law has a long reach, even out here in your wilderness. We'll be back, with a marshal next time. Looking forward to it. They rode off in a cloud of dust and injured dignity. Silas didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight, then set it aside and crossed to where Evelyn stood frozen. You all right? She nodded, then shook her head, then surprised them both by bursting into tears. He gathered her against him, her face pressed to his shirt, her whole body shaking. I'm sorry, she gasped between sobs. I'm so sorry. I thought I'd run far enough. I thought... Hush! He stroked her hair, loosened now from its usual severe style. Nothing to be sorry for. They'll ruin you. Everything you've built here. Let them try. He pulled back enough to see her face, thumbing away tears. Evelyn, look at me. I meant what I said. I've done worse than you. Hell, what you did wasn't wrong at all. It was justice, plain and simple. If the law can't see that, then the law's wrong. They have money, influence. They can buy witnesses, buy judges. This ain't Richmond. Out here, money only goes so far. Judge Morrison's as honest as they come, and Sheriff Watson might not like us much, but he likes Eastern interference even less. He cupped her face gently. We'll fight this. Together. She searched his eyes. Why? Why would you risk everything for me? The question hung between them in the spring air. He could have given her the easy answer. Duty, honor, the protection he'd promised. Instead, he gave her the truth. Because somewhere between that first night and now, I went and fell in love with you. Her breath caught. Silas, I know we said no romance. I know you've got every reason not to trust men or love or any of it. But I'm a simple man. Evelyn, I don't know how to feel things halfway. And what I feel for you... She kissed him. Not the careful, tentative kisses they'd shared before, but something desperate and fierce. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, I love you too. God help me. I do. That's why I can't let them destroy you. Only way they destroy me is if they take you away. He gripped her shoulders. And that ain't happening. I don't care if I have to fight every Blackwood from here to the Atlantic. That night, the physical barrier they'd maintained crumbled entirely. In the privacy of their bedroom, they came together with a passion born of fear and defiance and the need to claim something good in the face of threat. Silas traced her scars with reverent fingers while she mapped the old wounds that marked his body. Bullet graze here, knife slash there, each a story of survival. Afterward, They lay entwined, sweat cooling on their skin, listening to the night sounds outside their window. "They'll come back," Evelyn said quietly. "Let them. I've got some friends from the old days, men who owe me favors. If the Blackwoods want a war, they'll get one." She propped herself on an elbow to look at him. "I don't want you becoming that man again, the one you buried up here. Sometimes we don't get to choose who we need to be." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But this is different. This is protecting what's mine, what's ours. Nothing wrong in that. The garden will need tending. The goats need milking. We can't leave. Then we don't leave. We make our stand right here." She laid her head on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, and the wind sighed through the pines. Their little cabin, their hard-won peace, seemed fragile as spun glass, but there was steel in both of them, forged in different fires but equally strong. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "I'm not sorry," she said suddenly. "For killing him, I'd do it again." "I know. Does that make me a monster?" "No." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Makes you a survivor, and that's what we do, you and me. We survive." As sleep finally claimed them, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight they had each other, and that was enough. The war for their future had begun. The days after the Blackwoods' visit passed intense vigilance. Silas kept his rifle close and taught Evelyn to shoot with the Navy Colt he'd carried during his wilder days. She proved a quick study, her hands steady despite never having held a gun before. "Aim for the chest," he instructed as she practiced on tin cans set along the fence. Bigger target than the head, and just as effective. She squeezed the trigger, the shot ringing across the meadow. The can spun off its post. "I was aiming for the chest," she said dryly, "of a very small man." Despite the levity, they both knew the stakes. Word had already reached town. Several folks had seen the Eastern strangers riding through, asking questions. Some answered, some didn't, but damage was done either way. It was on the 5th day that Marshal Wade Garrison arrived. He came alone, which Silas took as a good sign. They knew Garrison by reputation, a fair man who'd kept the peace in 3 territories before settling in Wyoming. He was older, weathered, with the careful eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to see most everything. "Boone," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mrs. Boone. Mind if I come in? Rather discuss this over coffee than gunplay." They sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn serving coffee with hands that barely trembled. The marshal took his time, sipping appreciatively before speaking. "Good coffee. My wife can't make it worth a damn, bless her heart." He set down the cup. "I've got 3 Eastern gentlemen in town making serious allegations. They've got papers, witnesses back in Virginia ready to testify. They want me to arrest your wife for murder and theft." "It was self-defense," Evelyn said quietly. "I believe you." The marshal's response surprised them both. "See, I did some checking. Telegraphed a friend in Richmond law enforcement. Seems Thaddeus Blackwood had quite a reputation. 2 former servants came forward after his death, talking about what they'd seen but been too scared to report. Young women who'd left the household sudden-like." Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap. "They never said anything during the trial." Blackwood family made sure of that. "But my friend, he's been building a case. Seems you weren't the first woman Thaddeus hurt. Just the first to survive it." "Then why?" "Because the law's the law, and there's procedures to follow." Garrison sighed. "The Blackwoods are demanding extradition. They've got themselves a fancy lawyer who knows all the right words. I can delay things, but not forever, unless—" "Unless what?" Silas leaned forward. "Unless we handle this the territorial way. Public hearing, here in Grizzly Hollow. Let folks hear both sides, make their own judgment. It ain't official-like, but it carries weight. If the town stands behind you, makes it harder for outsiders to force the issue." "The town hates me," Evelyn said flatly. "Some do. Others are starting to wonder why the Blackwoods are so fired up to drag a woman back for a crime she was already acquitted of. Folks out here understand defending yourself. They also don't much like rich Easterners throwing weight around. Silas and Evelyn exchanged glances. It was a risk, but what choice did they have? When? Silas asked. 3 days. Saturday afternoon at the meeting hall. I'll make sure word gets out. Garrison stood, then paused. Ma'am, I've been doing this job a long time. I've seen guilty folks and innocent ones. You've got the look of someone who did what they had to do. That's different from murder in my book. After he left, they sat in silence until Evelyn spoke. I should run, disappear into the mountains. It would be easier. No, Silas's voice was firm. We face this together, or not at all. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation. To their surprise, they had allies. Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, stopped by with preserved vegetables and quiet encouragement. She knew what it was like to be judged by appearance. Tom Martinez, the Mexican blacksmith who'd faced his own share of prejudice, offered to speak on their behalf. Even Doc Hartwell, crusty and ancient, grudgingly admitted he'd treated women with similar injuries to what Evelyn had likely endured. But they had enemies too. Reverend Walsh preached a sermon about the sanctity of marriage and the duties of a wife to submit to her husband, Mrs. Walsh organized the proper ladies of the town to demand justice for poor Mr. Blackwood. The night before the hearing, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching clouds scud across the moon. Silas joined her, pulling her back against his chest. Scared? Terrified? She leaned into his warmth. I've been through a trial before. I know how these things go. They'll paint me as a Jezebel, a gold digger, a cold-blooded killer. They'll make Thaddeus sound like a saint. This ain't a Richmond courtroom. These people know hard choices. Do they know what it's like to lie there, night after night, wondering if this is the time he goes too far? To smile at breakfast with bruises hidden under powder? To have everyone know but no one help because it's not their business what a man does with his property? Her voice had risen, cracking with old pain. Silas turned her to face him. They'll know tomorrow, because you're going to tell them. Not the lawyer's version or the gossip's version. Yours. I don't know if I can. You can. You're the strongest woman I know. Evelyn Boone. You survived him. You survived the trial. You survived coming out here and starting over. This is just one more fight. She buried her face against his chest. What if we lose? Then we run, together, Mexico, maybe, or California, somewhere the Blackwoods can't reach. He tilted her chin up. But we're not going to lose. Know why? Why? Because this time, you're not alone. Saturday dawned clear and bright, spring sun warming the valley. The meeting hall was packed by afternoon, every seat taken and people standing along the walls. At the front, a table had been set up for Marshal Garrison, who would oversee the proceedings. The Blackwood contingent sat on one side, James, Hutchins, the lawyer, and Porter, the detective, all in their Eastern finery. They'd been joined by Reverend Walsh and his faction of the town. Silas and Evelyn sat on the other side, flanked by their small but determined group of supporters. Evelyn wore her best dress, simple black wool, but clean and pressed. She'd pinned her hair up severely, and made no attempt to hide the scar. Let them see, she decided. Let them understand. Marshal Garrison called for order. This ain't a legal trial, he announced. It's a hearing to help me decide whether Mrs. Boone should be sent back to Virginia to face charges, or whether the matter should be considered settled. We'll hear from both sides. Then I'll make my decision based on what's presented and the will of the community. Hutchins rose first, smooth as oil. He painted a picture of Thaddeus Blackwood as a pillar of Richmond society, a loving husband tragically cut down in his prime. He produced affidavits from servants, the same ones who'd been too frightened to speak before, now suddenly remembering things differently. He talked about missing jewelry, about Evelyn's calculating nature, about how she'd entrapped the poor man. She's done it again, here in your own town, he concluded. Found another lonely man to manipulate. How long before Mr. Boone meets a similar fate? There were murmurs from the crowd, some nodding, others frowning. Eveline kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but Silas could see her hands trembling where they lay folded in her lap. Then it was their turn. Doc Hartwell spoke first, his clinical description of injuries he'd seen on women in difficult domestic situations, making several ladies fan themselves. Tom Martinez talked about second chances and the right to defend oneself. Mrs. Chen, in halting but determined English, described seeing Eveline's kindness to her children. Finally, Marshal Garrison looked at Eveline. "Ma'am, would you like to speak?" She stood slowly. The hall fell silent. "My name is Eveline Boone," she began, voice quiet but clear. "Before that, yes, I was Evelyn Blackwood. And before that, I was just Evelyn Carter, a governess who thought she'd found love." She told them everything. The courtship, the early signs she'd ignored, the escalation, the isolation, the first time he'd hit her, backhanded her for speaking to the grocer too long, the way he'd cried afterward, sworn it would never happen again. But it did, again and again. And each time, it got worse. He was careful. You see, never where it would show, never in front of witnesses. Just enough to keep me afraid. Keep me obedient. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, and she began to move, pacing slightly as if the motion helped the words flow. "Mr. Hutchins talks about missing jewelry. Yes, I took some pieces when I fled that night. Pieces that had been mine before marriage, gifts from my grandmother. I sold them to pay for a lawyer, for room and board during the trial. If that makes me a thief, so be it." She stopped pacing, faced the crowd directly. The night he died, Thaddeus had been drinking heavily. He'd seen me smile at a delivery boy, just a polite smile, nothing more, but in his mind, I was unfaithful. He brought out a knife, said he'd mark me so no other man would want me. Her hand went to her scar. He succeeded in that, at least, but when he came back for a second cut, aimed at my face, I grabbed the poker from the fireplace. I swung it. Once, he fell and didn't get up. The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the children were quiet. "I'm not sorry," she continued. "God help me. I'm sorry it came to that. I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. But I'm not sorry I'm alive instead of him." She looked at James Blackwood. "Your brother was a monster, sir. You know it. Your family knows it. And all your money can't change that truth." She sat back down. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the room, a woman stood up. "Mary Perkins, the seamstress, known to be proper and church-going." "Marshal, might I speak?" Garrison nodded. "Floor's yours, Mrs. Perkins." The woman looked uncomfortable but determined. 15 years ago, I worked as a maid in Kansas City. For a wealthy family. The son! He was like this Blackwood fellow. Charming in public. Devil in private. His wife. She tried to leave once. He caught her at the train station. Brought her home. 3 days later, she was dead. Fell down the stairs, they said. She lifted her chin. I saw the bruises before they buried her. If she'd fought back like Mrs. Boone here, she might be alive today. Another woman stood, then another, each with a story, their own or someone they'd known. Women trapped in marriages that were prisons, some who'd escaped, others who hadn't. The men in the room grew increasingly uncomfortable as the truth of what their wives, sisters, and daughters sometimes endured was laid bare. Finally, Marshal Garrison called for order. "I've heard enough. This is a matter for the people of Grizzly Hollow to weigh in on. All those who believe Mrs. Boone should be sent back to Virginia, stand on the left. Those who believe justice has already been served, stand on the right." The room erupted in movement. When the dust settled, the split was clear, but the right side held a firm majority. Even some who'd been hostile before had been swayed. Reverend Walsh stood on the left, but his own wife, in a shocking act of rebellion, had moved to the right. James Blackwood shot to his feet. "This is a mockery. You can't—" "I can and I will," Garrison cut him off. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm denying your request for extradition. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as this town is concerned, justice was served the night your brother died. You're free to appeal to the territorial governor if you like, but I suspect you'll find Wyoming folks have similar views on a man's or woman's right to self-defense. This isn't over, Blackwood snarled. Yes, it is. Silas stood now, moving to stand beside his wife. You've had your hearing. You've lost. Now get out of our town and don't come back. The Easterners left in high dudgeon, Hutchins muttering about frontier justice and lawlessness. But they left, and that was what mattered. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped to nod at Evelyn or murmur words of support. Some of the women squeezed her hand, silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. It wasn't total acceptance, that would take time, but it was a beginning. That night, as they lay in bed listening to a late spring thunderstorm roll through the valley, Evelyn finally let herself cry. Not tears of fear or pain, but of relief, of release. It's over, she whispered against Silas's shoulder. It's really over. That part is, he agreed, stroking her hair. Now we get to the good part, the living part. She rose up to look at him in the flickering lightning. I love you, Silas Boone. Have I told you that today? Not since this morning. Shameful oversight. She kissed him softly. I love you for standing by me, for believing me, for being the man Thaddeus never was and never could be. I love you too, Evelyn Boone, scar and all, past and all, now and always. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their cabin, all was peace. The ghosts hadn't vanished entirely. They never would, but they'd been faced down, named, and robbed of their power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. The garden to tend, the goats to milk, a life to build together on this mountainside. They'd fought for their future and won. Now all that remained was to live it. The acrid smell of smoke woke Silas from a dead sleep. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, caught in one of his nightmares where burning wagons and screaming horses haunted the darkness. Then Evelyn's hand gripped his shoulder, her voice urgent. Fire! Silas! The house is on fire! The smoke was thicker now, seeping under the bedroom door. He could hear the crackle of flames from the main room. Without thinking, he grabbed Evelyn, wrapped her in the quilt from their bed, and headed for the window. We go out this way, he said, already working to force open the shutters that had swollen shut with spring rain. The wood groaned, resisted, then finally gave way. He helped her through first, then followed, both of them tumbling into the herb garden Evelyn had planted just weeks before. Behind them, their home erupted into an inferno. Flames licked through the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The heat was intense even at a distance, and Silas pulled Evelyn further back, toward the shelter of the trees. The animals, she gasped, but he held her firm. Too late. Look! The barn was already ablaze, flames consuming the small structure where their milk goats and chickens had been penned for the night. The horses, thank God, were in the far pasture, but everything else, their winter stores, tools, the new plow he'd just bought, all of it was gone. They stood in their nightclothes, barefoot and shivering despite the heat from the fires, watching their life burn. Evelyn was silent, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, tears tracking down her cheeks. This wasn't an accident, Silas said grimly. The wind was calm tonight, no lightning, no knocked-over lantern, and the fact that both buildings had gone up simultaneously. The Blackwoods, Evelyn whispered. Oh God, Silas, they did this, because of me. He turned her to face him, gripping her shoulders. Because of them, not you, never you. A sound from the forest made him spin, pushing Evelyn behind him. But it was Tom Martinez who emerged from the trees, rifle in hand, followed by Doc Hartwell and several other men from town. Saw the glow from the valley, Tom explained. Figured there might be trouble after those Eastern fellows left town making threats. Anyone see them tonight? Silas asked. Porter fellow was drinking heavy at the Lucky Strike. One of the men volunteered. Left around midnight. Said something about teaching folks a lesson about frontier justice. Evelyn made a sound, half sob, half laugh. Frontier justice. They burn us out in the night like cowards and call it justice. Ma'am, Doc Hartwell said gruffly. You folks can't stay here. Come to town, least for tonight. We'll sort this come morning. But Evelyn was already shaking her head, that familiar steel creeping back into her spine. No, they want us to run. We stay. They burn our home. We rebuild. I'm done letting Blackwood men drive me from place to place. Evelyn, Silas began. No. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, looking like some ancient warrior queen. I ran from Richmond. I ran from Baltimore. I ran all the way to Wyoming. I'm not running anymore. Tom Martinez looked at Silas. She always this stubborn? Pretty much, Silas admitted, pride and worry warring in his chest. Well then, Tom shouldered his rifle. Reckon we better get to work come dawn. Can't leave neighbors without a roof. The other men nodded agreement. It was the way of the frontier. You helped your own. And sometime in the past weeks, Silas and Evelyn had become that, their own. They spent the rest of the night in the root cellar, the only structure that had survived. It was cramped and cold, but it was shelter. Evelyn dozed fitfully against Silas's shoulder while he kept watch, rifle across his knees, listening for any sound that might signal the arsonist's return. Dawn revealed the full extent of the damage. The cabin was a blackened skeleton, chimney stones standing like a gravestone. The barn was completely gone, just a patch of ash and char. But as the sun climbed higher, so did hope. Wagons began arriving from town, loaded with lumber, tools, and people ready to work. Mrs. Chen brought breakfast and clothes for Evelyn. Mary Perkins had gathered fabric for new curtains, when you're ready for them. Even some who'd stood against them at the hearing came to help, united by outrage at this cowardly attack. Nobody burns out folks in our town, Sheriff Watson said, having ridden up with more volunteers. Already got wires out to every lawman in 3 territories. Those Blackwood boys won't get far. The work began immediately. Men cleared debris while women sorted salvageable items from the ashes. Evelyn found her cast-iron skillet, warped but whole. Silas recovered the metal box where they'd kept their money and important papers. The contents singed but intact. It was midday when Evelyn made her discovery. She'd been sifting through what had been their bedroom when she found it. A pocket watch, gold and ornate. Definitely not theirs. She knew that watch. She'd seen it countless times. Checking the hour, marking time until Thaddeus decided to come home. It had been his father's, passed down through Blackwood men for generations. James was here, she said quietly, showing it to Silas. He dropped this. He wanted me to know it was him. Silas's face darkened. Then he made a mistake. This is evidence. Is it enough? With the witnesses who saw Porter at the saloon? With the threats they made public at the hearing? Sheriff Watson had approached. Overhearing. It's enough for me to put out arrest warrants. Arson's a hanging offense in the territory. Evelyn closed her hand around the watch, feeling its weight. They'll run back east, hide behind their money and connections. Maybe, the sheriff admitted. But they'll be wanted men. Can't never come back here. And word has a way of spreading. The Blackwood name won't protect them forever. Not after this. The rebuilding continued through the day. By evening, they had the framework of a new cabin up, smaller than before, but sturdy. It would take weeks to finish properly, but it was a start. Tom Martinez had already promised to help with a new barn, and others had pledged livestock to replace what was lost. As the sun set, painting the mountains gold and red, the helpers began to drift away. Promises to return tomorrow, offerings of spare furniture and supplies, quiet words of encouragement. Soon it was just Silas and Evelyn again, sitting on what would be their new porch, sharing a meal of donated food. I should have left when they first came, Evelyn said quietly. None of this would have happened. And I'd have spent the rest of my life wondering what became of you, Silas countered. Wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you ever found peace. Have I brought you anything but trouble? He set down his plate and pulled her close. You've brought me life, Evelyn. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting to die. You changed that. By bringing violence to your door, by bringing yourself to my door." He kissed her forehead, tasting ash and sweat and the essential sweetness that was her. "I'd face 100 Blackwoods for one day with you. Hell, I'd burn my own damn cabin down if that's what it took." She laughed despite herself, a watery sound. "Don't give them ideas." They slept that night under the stars, wrapped in donated blankets, the skeleton of their new home rising beside them. Evelyn woke once to find Silas gone, but before panic could set in, she spotted him, standing guard at the edge of their clearing, rifle in hand, protecting what was theirs. 3 days later, word came that the Blackwood party had been arrested trying to board a train in Cheyenne. James had indeed been carrying the matching chain to his father's watch, and Porter, still drunk, had bragged about the fire to his cellmates. They would stand trial in Wyoming territory, far from the influence of Richmond society. "It's not over," Evelyn said when they heard the news. "The family won't give up. There'll be lawyers, appeals, attempts to move the trial." "Let them try," Silas said firmly. "We've got something they don't." "What's that?" "Community, truth, and the kind of justice that can't be bought." He was right. When the trial came 2 months later, half of Grizzly Hollow made the journey to Cheyenne to testify. The jury, made up of ranchers, miners, and frontier women who understood the realities of survival, took less than an hour to convict. James Blackwood was sentenced to 10 years hard labor. Porter got 7. Hutchins, who claimed he'd known nothing of the arson plot, was disbarred and sent back east in disgrace. The news of the conviction reached them as they were putting the final touches on their new cabin. It was smaller than the original, but somehow warmer, filled with gifts from neighbors, a quilt from Mary Perkins, dishes from Mrs. Chen, a rocking chair Tom Martinez had made with his own hands. That night, as they christened their new bedroom properly, Evelyn traced the scars on Silas's chest, old wounds from his violent past. "We match," she said softly. "Both marked by the lives we lived before." "But healing," he pointed out, catching her hand and kissing her fingertips. Together. She rose above him in the moonlight streaming through their new window, her own scar silver in the pale light. "I love you, Silas Boone. Thank you for not letting me run." "Thank you for not letting me hide," he replied, pulling her down for a kiss that said everything else. Outside, an owl called across the mountain meadow. The garden they'd replanted was already showing green shoots. The new goats, gifts from 3 different families, bleated sleepily from their pen. Life went on, resilient and stubborn as the people who carved homes from wilderness. The Blackwoods had tried to burn them out, but instead had only forged them stronger. Like metal in a fire, they'd been tested and emerged transformed, no longer 2 damaged souls seeking refuge, but partners bound by shared trials and earned trust. In the morning, there would be chores to do, meals to cook, a life to continue building. But for now, they had this, each other, their new home, and the knowledge that they'd faced the worst and survived. The frontier had made many promises to those brave enough to seek it. For Silas and Evelyn Boone, it had kept the most important one, the chance to write their own ending, free from the shadows of the past. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed to the rafters, the July heat making the crowded room stifling. Evelyn sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her gray eyes steady on James Blackwood across the courtroom. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by 2 months in territorial jail, his fine clothes replaced by rough prisoner's garb. "Mrs. Boone," the prosecutor, a sharp young man named Davidson, addressed her. "Can you identify the object I'm holding?" "Yes, that's the Blackwood family watch. It belonged to my late husband's father and was passed to his eldest son upon his death." "And where was this watch found?" "In the ashes of my home, the morning after it was burned." James's lawyer, imported from Denver, stood quickly. "Objection. We have no proof that watch was dropped during the alleged arson. Judge Cooper, a no-nonsense man who'd presided over territorial courts for 15 years, frowned. Overruled. The witness may continue. Evelyn's testimony was clear, concise. She spoke of the threats, the attempted intimidation, the fire that had nearly killed them. When she was done, half the gallery was in tears. The other half looked ready to form a lynch mob. But it was the testimony that came after that truly sealed James Blackwood's fate. One by one. The people of Grizzly Hollow took the stand. Tom Martinez described organizing the rebuilding effort and finding the watch. Doc Hartwell testified about treating Evelyn's burns from escaping through the window. Even Reverend Walsh, in a surprising turn, admitted he'd seen the Blackwood party acting suspicious the day of the fire. The most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. Lily Malone, one of the saloon girls from the Lucky Strike, took the stand in a modest dress, her usual rouge and powder absent. "Porter was drinking at the bar," she said, voice clear despite her nervousness. "Buying rounds, celebrating. Said they'd taught that uppity woman a lesson she wouldn't forget. Said the boss," she pointed at James, "had done the deed himself while Porter kept watch." "Lies," James burst out. "You can't trust the word of a—" "Mr. Blackwood." Judge Cooper's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst and I'll have you gagged. Continue, Miss Malone." Lily lifted her chin. "He said Mr. James Blackwood lit the fire himself. Wanted to be sure she saw her new life burn, just like she'd destroyed his brother's." The defense tried to discredit her, painting her as a woman of loose morals whose word meant nothing. But Lily held firm, and 2 other patrons corroborated her story. By the time the prosecution rested, the case was all but decided. Silas had testified too, his controlled fury evident as he described finding his wife choking on smoke, their home in flames around them. But it was during the defense's cross-examination that something unexpected happened. "Mr. Boone," the defense lawyer said smoothly, "you've admitted to having a violent past. Haven't you killed men yourself?" "I have," Silas said steadily. "In war and after. Shot men who were trying to kill me or mine, but I never snuck up on them in the night like a coward. Never burned out families. There's killing that's necessary, and there's murder. Your client chose murder, and yet you married a murderess." The courtroom tensed. Silas leaned forward slightly. "I married a survivor, a woman who defended herself against a monster. If that's murder in your book, mister, then your book ain't worth reading." The jury deliberated for 43 minutes. Guilty on all counts. James Blackwood was sentenced to 10 years hard labor. Porter got 7. The lawyer, Hutchins, who'd kept his hands technically clean, was disbarred and run out of the territory. As they led James away, he caught Evelyn's eye. "This isn't over," he snarled. "The Blackwood name means nothing here," she interrupted, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "Your brother is dead. You're going to prison, and I'm going to live my life. That's my justice." Outside the courthouse, the Grizzly Hollow contingent gathered around Silas and Evelyn. There were tears, embraces, promises of celebration when they got home. Sheriff Watson shook Silas's hand. "Justice served," he said gruffly. "Might have taken a while, but we got there." As the crowd dispersed, Evelyn stood quietly, looking back at the courthouse. Silas touched her elbow gently. "You all right?" "I need a moment," she said. I need to do something." She walked to the telegraph office down the street, Silas following curiously. At the counter, she wrote out a message in her careful script. "To Mrs. Althea Blackwood, Richmond, Virginia. James convicted of arson, 10 years prison. Thaddeus still dead. I'm finally free. Your former daughter-in-law, Evelyn Boone." The telegraph operator's eyes widened, but he sent it without comment. Evelyn paid him and turned back to Silas. "Petty?" she asked. "Honest," he replied, "and deserved." They made camp that night outside Cheyenne with the others from Grizzly Hollow, sharing food and stories around the fire. For the first time since the fire. Evelyn laughed freely, the sound bright as bells in the prairie darkness. When she and Silas retired to their bedroll, she curled against him with a contentment he'd never felt from her before. "It's really over," she murmured. "All of it. The running, the fear, the looking over my shoulder. It's done." "What's that feel like?" She was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "Like I can finally breathe. Like I can finally be." They returned to Grizzly Hollow as heroes of sorts. The town that had once whispered behind Eveline's back now embraced her as one of their own. She'd been tested by fire, literally, and emerged stronger. That was something frontier folks understood and respected. Their new cabin, built by community effort, had become a symbol of resilience. But Eveline had plans for more. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, she presented her idea to Silas. "There are other women," she said. "Like I was, trapped, scared, with nowhere to go. What if we could help them?" "Help how?" "A place to stay. Temporary, just until they get their feet under them. We've got the land. We could build a small cottage, maybe two, someplace safe where they could rest. Decide what comes next without fear." Silas considered. "That's a big undertaking, and it might bring trouble. When has that ever stopped us?" She took his hands. "I had nowhere to go but a mail-order bride advertisement. Other women might not be so lucky to find a man like you. They need options. You want to run a refuge for runaway wives? I want to offer what I needed, a chance to choose their own path." Her eyes were bright with purpose. "We could call it Haven House." He studied her face, this woman who'd arrived scared and scarred, who'd survived trial by fire and court, who'd found strength in community and love in an unlikely place. "All right," he said, "but we do it proper, legal-like, so no one can challenge it, and we'll need help. Already talked to Mary Perkins and Mrs. Chen. They're in. Doc Hartwell says he'll provide medical care. Even got a letter from Marshal Garrison saying he'd support it." "You've been planning this?" "For weeks." She grinned, looking younger than he'd ever seen her. Surprise. He pulled her close, kissing her soundly. "Woman, you'll never stop surprising me." Construction on Haven House began that fall, with the same community support that had rebuilt their own home. By the time snow flew, they had a sturdy cottage ready, with room for 3 women and their children if need be. Word spread quietly, carefully, through churches that actually practiced compassion, through doctors who treated injuries they couldn't report, through the network of women who understood. The first resident arrived in December, a young woman named Clara from Denver, her arm in a sling and her eyes holding that familiar, haunted look. Eveline welcomed her with hot soup and no questions beyond, "What do you need?" That night, as snow fell softly outside, Eveline stood at their bedroom window, watching lamplight glow in Haven House's windows. Silas wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Proud of you," he said simply. "It's just a start. Most important things are." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I want to write that letter now." He knew which letter, the one she'd been composing in her head for months. Together, they sat at the kitchen table as she penned a message to Althea Blackwood. "Mrs. Blackwood, your son sought to destroy me as your other son tried to do. Both failed. I have found love, purpose, and peace in a place you would consider beneath you. I help women escape men like your sons. I consider this my life's work now, saving others from the fate you helped create by raising monsters and calling them gentlemen. I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. May you find the peace that comes with acknowledging truth. Eveline Boone." She sealed it, addressed it, and set it aside to post. Then she took the oil lamp and lifted it to the window, a signal to Haven House that all was well. Help was here if needed. It was answered by a flutter of curtain. Clara, acknowledging the light. "Come to bed," Silas said softly. "Tomorrow will be busy enough." As they settled under their quilts, the snow continuing its gentle fall, Eveline felt the last chains of her past break free. She was no longer Thaddeus Blackwood's victim or Virginia society's scandal. She was Eveline Boone, wife, neighbor, protector of the vulnerable. She'd ordered her life like a mail-order bride, desperate and running. But what had stepped off that train in Grizzly Hollow had transformed into something neither she nor Silas could have imagined. A woman who'd claimed her power, a partnership forged in fire, a future bright with purpose. The letter to Althea Blackwood would be the last time she'd acknowledge that old life. Tomorrow, there would be a new woman to help, a new story of survival to support. But tonight, she was simply home, safe in the arms of a man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to stand beside her. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under their blanket of snow. Inside, two survivors had built something worth saving, a love that had weathered storms, a home that had risen from ashes, and a legacy that would outlive them both. Spring of 1883 arrived with thunderstorms and wildflowers, painting the Wyoming mountains in brilliant splashes of color. Haven House had sheltered 7 women over the winter months, each finding their own path forward. Some had returned to families who finally believed them. Others had found work in towns where their past didn't follow. And Clara, the first resident, had stayed on to help Eveline run the refuge. It was on a particularly fine May morning that Eveline first felt the quickening in her belly. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't dared hope. Now, standing in her garden with the sun warming her face and new life stirring within her, she allowed herself to believe. She found Silas in the barn, repairing a harness. He looked up as she entered, immediately reading something in her expression. "What is it? More trouble?" "No." She took his grease-stained hands in hers. "No trouble. A blessing. I hope." Understanding dawned slowly across his weathered face. "You mean?" "Late November. Doc Hartwell thinks. Maybe early December." The harness fell forgotten as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a gentle spin. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." He cupped her face in his hands. "Eveline, I thought I'd used up all my chances at good things. Then you came along and proved me wrong. Now this? I'm not happy. I'm thunderstruck." They stood there in the dusty barn, holding each other, letting the miracle sink in. A child born of love. Not duty or ownership. A new life to balance all the death they'd both seen. "I was afraid," Eveline admitted against his chest. "That maybe I couldn't, that Thaddeus had damaged me too much, or that God was punishing me for being glad he's dead." "No." Silas pulled back to look at her fiercely. "Don't you ever think that this baby is proof that you survived to do more than just exist? You survived to love and be loved, to help others, to create life. That's not punishment. That's grace." Word spread through Grizzly Hollow as such news did in small towns. The women who'd once whispered behind fans now stopped Eveline on the street to offer congratulations and advice. Baby clothes appeared on their doorstep, some new-made, others carefully preserved from children now grown. Even Reverend Walsh's wife, who'd taken to attending a different church since the trial, sent a beautifully embroidered blanket. Haven House continued its work, with Clara taking on more responsibilities as Eveline's pregnancy progressed. They were careful, accepting only women who came through trusted channels, maintaining the fiction that it was simply a boarding house for relatives visiting from back east. Most folks knew the truth but kept quiet, understanding that some services were best provided without too much scrutiny. It was in August, when Eveline was heavy with child and moving like a ship in full sail, that unexpected visitors arrived. A fancy carriage, out of place on the rough mountain road, pulled up to their cabin. Silas, instantly wary, kept his rifle close as a well-dressed elderly woman descended, aided by a younger man in lawyer's attire. Eveline, who'd been resting on the porch, struggled to her feet. When she saw the woman's face, she gripped the railing hard. "Althea!" Thaddeus's mother looked older, diminished. Her black mourning dress hung loose on her frame, and her once imperious bearing had softened into something almost frail. But her eyes, those cold Blackwood eyes, remained sharp. "Eveline." She took in the obvious pregnancy, the thriving homestead, the contentment written on her former daughter-in-law's face. "May we speak?" Silas moved to Evelyn's side, a clear warning in his stance. "State your business and be quick about it." Althea's lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blackwood has come to settle matters. She received your letter, Mrs. Boone." It prompted considerable reflection. "Inside," Evelyn said quietly. "But you come in peace, or you leave in pieces. My husband doesn't make idle threats." They gathered around the kitchen table. Such a different scene from the last time Blackwoods had entered this home. Althea's hands shook slightly as she accepted a cup of tea. "I know what my sons were," she began without preamble. "I've always known. Their father was the same, charming in public, cruel in private. I thought if I raised them with enough discipline, enough social standing, it would be different. I was wrong." Evelyn said nothing, waiting. After James was sent to prison, I began receiving letters from women, wives of family friends, daughters of business associates, all with stories about my sons, things they'd never dared speak before. Althea's voice cracked. 23 letters. Evelyn, 23 women my boys had hurt in various ways. You were just the only one who fought back. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked bluntly. "Forgiveness?" I gave that already, for my own sake. "No, I want to make what amends I can." She nodded to the lawyer, who produced a leather folder. "The Blackwood estate is substantial. I'm dying, cancer, the doctors say. Months at best. I want to leave the money to your refuge. All of it." The silence in the room was profound. Silas's hand found Evelyn's under the table. "Blood money," Evelyn said finally. "Yes," Althea agreed. "But it could do good now. How many women could you help with proper funding? How many havens could you build?" Evelyn looked at Silas, reading support in his eyes. She thought of Clara, of the 6 women who'd passed through their doors, of the letters that came weekly, now asking for help they couldn't always provide. "There would be conditions," she said. "The Blackwood name goes nowhere near it. The money gets distributed through a trust, managed by people I choose, and you never contact us again after today." "Agreed." Althea seemed to shrink further. "I don't seek to ease my conscience. It's far too late for that. But perhaps some good can come from all that pain." Papers were signed, witnessed by Tom Martinez and Doc Hartwell, who'd been hastily summoned. The sum was staggering, enough to fund a dozen refugees, to help hundreds of women. Evelyn's hands trembled as she signed her name. As Althea prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "The child, when it's born, will you tell them about any of this?" "I'll tell them the truth," Evelyn said steadily. "That they come from survivors, that their parents chose love over fear. That's all they need to know." The old woman nodded and left without another word. They watched the carriage disappear down the mountain road, carrying away the last remnant of Evelyn's old life. "You all right?" Silas asked. "I think so." She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the baby move. "It's strange, all that pain, leading to something that might help so many, like God has a sense of irony, or justice," Clara said from the doorway where she'd been listening. "Real justice, not the court kind." November came with early snow and the pains of labor. Doc Hartwell was summoned, along with Mrs. Chen, who'd delivered half the babies in the valley. Silas paced the main room like a caged mountain cat while women's voices rose and fell behind the closed bedroom door. First babies take their time, Tom Martinez told him, having arrived to keep his friend company. "My Maria was in labor near 20 hours with our eldest." 20 hours? Silas looked ready to kick down the door. But Evelyn, for all she'd endured in life, was determined in this too. As the sun set on the frozen landscape, a new cry pierced the air, strong, healthy, unmistakably alive. "Mrs. Chen emerged, beaming. "A daughter, Mr. Boone, perfect as a spring morning." He was allowed in to find Evelyn propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle in her arms, The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes, they were gray like her mother's, but holding something of Silas's steadiness already. Hope, Evelyn said softly. I want to call her Hope. Hope Catherine Boone. Hope, Silas repeated, touching his daughter's tiny fist with one trembling finger. It's perfect. As word spread, visitors came with gifts and congratulations. Haven House sent a quilt made by all the women who'd sheltered there. The town of Grizzly Hollow, which had once greeted Evelyn with suspicion, now celebrated her daughter as one of their own. That night, as snow fell softly outside and Hope slept between them in the bed, Silas too nervous to let her out of sight, Evelyn traced the familiar scar on her throat. It had faded over the months. No longer the angry red line, but a silver thread. A reminder, not a definition. What are you thinking? Silas asked softly. About circles, how I arrived here broken and scared. And now? She gestured to encompass their cabin. Their daughter, the refuge houses being built with Althea's money, the life they'd created. Now I'm home. We both are, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then one to Hope's downy head. We both are. Outside, the mountains stood eternal watch. Inside, a former gunman, a woman who'd refused to be a victim, and their daughter born of hope and determination settled into sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more women to help, a daughter to raise, a legacy to build. But tonight, they were simply a family, whole and healing, proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest scars. In the spring, when Hope was old enough to travel, they would break ground on 3 new refuge houses in neighboring territories. The Boone Foundation, carefully named to avoid any hint of its origins, would eventually help over 1,000 women find their freedom, and somewhere in Wyoming, in a cabin built by community and sustained by love. A little girl would grow up knowing that her mother had once stepped off a train as a mail-order bride, frightened and alone, and had become a force of nature that no man could break. The scar on Evelyn's throat would fade but never disappear, a silver line pointing the way from who she'd been forced to be to who she'd chosen to become. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love, survival, and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Are you by a cozy fireplace, on a long drive through the countryside, or perhaps winding down after a hard day's work? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about Evelyn and Silas's journey. Did their story of resilience touch your heart as it did mine? Drop a comment below and let's gather round our virtual campfire to share what this story meant to you.